Mr. John Sifton.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to testify as well in today's hearing. Today's date is June 4th. It's, of course, a day of infamy among human rights groups, and it's fitting and proper that we remember why for a moment. It was on this day in 1989 that the Chinese army, in a vanguard of tanks and bullets, pushed across the streets of Beijing to end a massive protest at Tiananmen Square. And countless people were killed on that day 24 years ago, calling for democracy and freedom. That quest, the quest for human rights, is of course not limited to China, and it didn't die at Tiananmen. In Vietnam today, people from really across the spectrum of society are regularly engaging in protests and other forms of free speech. All kinds of people, students and workers and teachers and farmers and bloggers and religious leaders and even former police and soldiers, Vietnam's citizens criticizing their government, reporting on corruption and poor governments, or even mocking the Communist Party's stridency. There was a protest just 2 days ago in Hanoi criticizing the government for its China policy. And of course, it bears remarking here that many of these protests are resulting in arrests and convictions. They're involving dissidents protesting land seizures. A lot of these protests are about that. The record is getting worse. We now know that in 2012, 40 people are known to have been convicted and sentenced to prison for peaceful dissent cases. This was an increase from 2011, which itself was an increase from 2010. And already this year, in the first 5 months of this year, more than 50 people have been convicted now in political trials, which more than matches last year's record. So to repeat that, in the first few months of this year, more people have been convicted in political trials than in the whole of last year in Vietnam. Since I last testified in April, there have been almost no improvements, just more prison sentences. On May 16th, 2 activists, Nguyen Phung Yuen and Dinh Nguyen Ca, were sentenced to 6 years and 8 years in prison, respectively. These women were sentenced, this one woman and one man were sentenced for handing out pamphlets. A 21-year-old woman is going to jail for 6 years for handing out pamphlets. On May 26, just a week ago, police arrested blogger Trung Uy Ngoc and charged him with abusing democracy and infringing on the interests of the state, a violation of Article 258. And on May 28th, just a few days ago, there was a trial of 8 ethnic Montagnards arrested in June of last year. They were convicted of violating Article 87, undermining national unity. Most of them received sentences of 7 to 11 years in prison. And on May 5th, earlier in the month, the case of these human rights picnics occurred. In 4 separate cities, police broke up peaceful human rights picnics at which young bloggers and activists were disseminating and discussing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, peaceful protests where people were sitting in parks reading aloud the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were broken up violently. Some of the people had their laptops confiscated, and when they went to police stations to attempt to get them back, one of them was punched in the face. His mother was burned with a cigarette on her forehead, and her sister had her teeth knocked out. This was on May 5th. The anti-China protests I mentioned just this past Sunday ended with arrests and more beatings by police as well. So in summary, the trend lines are showing a worsening situation. It's not just another bad year in Vietnam. I also want to give the subcommittee an update with respect to media freedom, an important issue that's come up lately. As Human Rights Watch and other groups have reported previously, the government continues to engage in blocking and filtering of internet websites, but recently the authorities also tightened rules on television. Authorities promulgated a new restriction known as Decision 20, requiring that outside broadcast companies licensed to carry cable or broadcast in Vietnam, for instance, CNN and BBC, They have to pay for translation and editing of their content. This is censorship, the editing part, at least. And this will be performed by a Vietnamese agency licensed by the government. The regulation also notes that content can only be broadcast which is appropriate to the people's healthy needs and does not violate Vietnamese press law. There are, of course, many other human rights issues to discuss with Vietnam: religious persecution, chief among them, land evictions, which we've already heard about, a ban on all unauthorized unions and other labor organizations, and administrative detention and forced labor for alleged drug users. 40,000 people in administrative detention without due process for alleged drug use. Some of them are drug users, others are not. But either way, forced labor in forced labor camps. Show trials with courts that lack independence continue. And in addition to all this, the basic brutality. Police regularly engage in mistreatment, sometimes torture. They beat detainees and even produce fatalities. So this is Vietnam today, a nation's governance characterized by brutality and systematic suppression of freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, with frequent persecution of those who question the government's actions or call for democratic alternatives. So what can the United States do about it? It's time for the United States government to see things for what they are. There was a hope a few years ago among administration officials that attempting a military strategic dialogue with Vietnam and opening trade negotiations in the context of a bilateral investment treaty or in the Trans-Pacific Partnership might serve as an incentive to the government to make changes and perhaps soften its authoritarian edge. It now appears that that hope was misplaced. Vietnamese authorities have not unclenched their fists. So Human Rights Watch would urge this subcommittee and the other subcommittee in tomorrow's hearing to keep asking the Obama administration very, very tough questions about its continuing dialogue with Vietnam. And I think it might be useful to talk realistically about what exactly the United States can do to change the Vietnamese government's behavior, and weigh what kinds of things would impact them more than others. Cutting all assistance to Vietnam in the generality might sound good, but in practice, it means cutting assistance to Agent Orange remediation, to PEPFAR for vital HIV/AIDS interventions, to global health programs for drug-resistant tuberculosis. These are things which perhaps the Vietnamese government would care less if the United States cut them, and yet doing so would have real impacts for ordinary Vietnamese citizens. So it might not be appropriate to just cut all U.S. assistance. Instead, the right questions are to be asking the administration, what really hurts the Vietnamese government? Is it suspending negotiations with Vietnam in the context of bilateral trade investment treaties, the TPP? If the Pentagon pulls back on its engagement? If the Pentagon puts up a complete brick wall to any discussion of lethal arms transfers ever, and makes it very clear that none of that will happen unless very stringent standards are met? We at Human Rights Watch think the time has come to start asking those kinds of tough, realistic questions about what exactly the U.S. hopes to do to get Vietnam to change its behavior. It's not just another year in Vietnam's long, sad history. It's been one of the worst years in quite a long time, and I think it's time for U.S. foreign policy to change. Thank you for...
Thank you so very much, Mr. Sifton.